backed his humorous gentleness with a sort of challenging courage. His new intimacy with Lord Alfred Douglas, coming on the top of his triumph as a playwright, was lending him aggressive self-confidence. There was in him that hybris, insolent self-assurance, which the Greek feared, the pride which goeth before destruction. I regretted the change in him and was nervously apprehensive. After dinner we all went out by the door which gives on the Embankment, for it was after 12:30. One of the party proposed that we should walk for a minute or two, at least as far as the Strand, before driving home. Oscar objected. He hated walking. It was a form of penal servitude to the animal in man, he declared. But he consented, nevertheless, under protest, laughing. When we were going up the steps to the Strand, he again objected, and quoted Dante's famous lines: "Tu proverai, siccome sa di sale, lo pane altrui, e come duro calle lo scendere il salir per l'altrui scale." Reader's translation: "You will discover how salty tastes another's bread, and how steep it is trailing up and down another's staircase." The impression made by Oscar that evening was not only of self-indulgence, but of over-confidence. I could not imagine what had given him this insolent self-complacence. I wanted to get by myself and think. Prosperity was certainly doing him no good. All the while the opposition to him, I felt, was growing in force. How could I verify this impression, I asked myself, so as to warn him effectually? I decided to give a lunch to him, and on purpose I put on the invitations: to meet Mr. Oscar Wilde and hear a new story. Out of a dozen invitations sent out to men, 7 or 8 were refused, 3 or 4 telling me in all kindness that they would rather not meet Oscar Wilde. This confirmed my worst fears. When Englishmen speak out in this way, the dislike must be near revolt. I gave the lunch and saw plainly enough that my forebodings were justified. Oscar was more self-confident, more contemptuous of criticism, more gross of body than ever, but his talk did not suffer, indeed it seemed to improve. At this lunch he told the charming fable of Narcissus, which is certainly one of his most characteristic short stories. "When Narcissus died, the flowers of the field were plunged in grief and asked the river for drops of water that they might mourn for him. 'Oh,' replied the river, 'if only my drops of water were tears, I should not have enough to weep for Narcissus myself. I loved him.' 'How could you help loving Narcissus?' said the flowers. 'So beautiful was he.' 'Was he beautiful?' asked the river. 'Who should know that better than you?' said the flowers, 'for every day, lying on your bank, he would mirror his beauty in your waters.' Oscar paused here and then went on: 'If I loved him,' replied the river, 'it is because when he hung over me, I saw the reflection of my own loveliness in his eyes.'" After lunch I took him aside and tried to warn him, told him that unpleasant stories were being put about against him. But he paid no heed to me. "All envy, Frank, and malice. What do I care? I go to Clumber this summer. Besides, I'm doing another play which I rather like. I always knew that playwriting was my province. As a youth I tried to write plays in verse. That was my mistake. Now I know better, I'm sure of myself and of success." Somehow or other, in spite of his apparent assurance, I felt he was in danger, and I doubted his quality as a fighter. But after all it was not my business. Wilful man must have his way. It seems to me now that my mistrust dated from the second paper war with Whistler, wherein, to the astonishment of everyone, Oscar did not come off victorious. As soon as he met with opposition, his power of repartee seemed to desert him, and Whistler, using mere rudeness and man-of-the-world sharpness, held the field. Oscar was evidently not a born fighter. I asked him once how it was he let Whistler off so lightly. He shrugged his shoulders and showed some irritation. "What could I say, Frank? Why should I belabour the beaten? The man is a wasp and delights in using his sting. I have done more, perhaps, than anyone to make him famous. I had no wish to hurt him." Was it magnanimity or weakness, or, as I think, a constitutional, a feminine shrinking from struggle and strife? Whatever the cause, it was clear that Oscar was what Shakespeare called himself, an unhurtful opposite. It is quite possible that if he had been attacked face to face, Oscar would have given a better account of himself. At Mrs. Grenfell's, now Lady Desborough, he crossed swords once with the Prime Minister, and came off victorious. Mr. Asquith began by bantering him, in appearance lightly, in reality seriously, for putting many of his sentences in italics. "The man who uses italics," said the politician, "is like the man who raises his voice in conversation and talks loudly in order to make himself heard." It was the well-known objection which Emerson had taken to Carlyle's overwrought style, pointed probably by dislike of the way Oscar monopolized conversation. Oscar met the stereotyped attack with smiling good humour. "How delightful of you, Mr. Asquith, to have noticed that! The brilliant phrase, like good wine, needs no bush. But just as the orator marks his good things by a dramatic pause, or by raising or lowering his voice, or by gesture, so the writer marks his epigrams with italics, setting the little gem, so to speak, like a jeweller. An excusable love of one's art, not all mere vanity, I like to think." All this with the most pleasant smile and manner. In measure as I distrusted Oscar's fighting power and admired his sweetness of nature, I took sides with him and wanted to help him. One day I heard some talk at the Pelican Club which filled me with fear for him and quickened my resolve to put him on his guard. I was going in just as Queensberry was coming out, with 2 or 3 of his special cronies. "I'll do it," I heard him cry. "I'll teach the fellow to leave my son alone. I'll not have their names coupled together." I caught a glimpse of the thrust-out combative face and the hot grey eyes. "What's it all about?" I asked. "Only Queensberry," said someone, "swearing he'll stop Oscar Wilde going about with that son of his, Alfred Douglas." Suddenly my fears took form. As in a flash I saw Oscar, heedless and smiling, walking along with his head in the air and that violent, combative, insane creature pouncing on him. I sat down at once and wrote begging Oscar to lunch with me the next day alone, as I had something important to say to him. He turned up in Park Lane, manifestly anxious, a little frightened, I think. "What is it?"